Welcome to another wonderful Susanna Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susanna Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. Maggie's Wyoming rancher. Chapter 1. A few of his friends and colleagues had hesitantly offered their attentions, but Maggie had been quick to turn them down, politely but firmly. If she was to marry again, she couldn't bear to remain in the confines of her familiar neighborhood of New York City. She would have to start over again, from the beginning, somewhere new. Somewhere that she had never been known as Mrs. Gerald Parker. She could go back to being Miss Margaret Susan Allen, with her whole life ahead of her. It was, as it had always been with Maggie, a case of all or nothing. And all, in this case, meant accepting a match with a rancher in a small town in Wyoming. The time from her acceptance to this very moment, waiting at the window of the train for it to slow to its final halt, seemed to have passed in a blur. Goldie had done much of her packing, at least, what little there was to do. After the debt to the doctor who had attended Gerald through his last few months was paid, as well as the duties to the undertaker, Maggie had been left near destitute. She'd had to sell almost everything they had owned and let the flat they'd lived in go, spending the last several months in the tiny spare room of the home Goldie shared with her husband and 2 children. Yes, she thought, her mind turning over the events of the recent past, it had been time to move on. Even if she was questioning herself, here and now, as the train puffed to a stop at last. She clutched at the wall beside her, desperate for stability, and took in a deep breath as a porter opened the door for her. The young man's cheerful smile, so unquestioningly welcoming, lifted her spirits at once, and she smiled back as he helped her down the few steps to the solid ground of the platform. "Welcome to Brownsville, miss. Any luggage?" "Just my carpet bag there." He nodded, taking it from the train and setting it beside her. "Only staying a little while, then, miss?" She shook her head, managing a smile even as her nerves jolted within her at the thought of just how long she was intending to stay. "No, in fact, Brownsville is my new home." She didn't think she was imagining the look of surprise in the young man's honest face, but he said nothing apart from, "Well, welcome again. I reckon you'll be met by a friend. Most folks wait just over the side of the platform, on the street. If you'll wait a moment, I'll carry your bag for you." "That's all right, I can manage." "Thank you." If she waited, she was afraid that her courage might fail her entirely and see her leaping back onto the train to turn around and go right back to New York, where, she was certain, her sister would scold her soundly and send her back west again. No, it was best all around if she struck out this very moment to find the man who was waiting for. At least, she hoped that he was waiting for her. The thought of trying to find him in this unknown town was intimidating, to say the least. She knew very little about the man to whom she was officially engaged. His name was Colton Hayes, and he was a rancher who owned a plot just outside of Brownsville. He was in his early 30s and had never been married. Apart from those few scarce details, she knew nothing, not even what he looked like. Of course, the matrimonial agency made no promises about anyone's appearance, nor were they able to furnish photographs of prospective matches. She hoped she would be able to determine who Mr. Hayes might be and hoped as well that he wouldn't be disappointed in her own appearance. The appreciative way the porter was looking at her made her blush. Would she feel just as strange if Mr. Hayes smiled at her with that same warmth in his eyes? It had been a very long time since she had felt able to return warmth for warmth, the way men and women did when flirting. Gerald's sudden turn for ill health had removed all thoughts of romance from their lives, and she doubted that she would be able to regain that long-lost earnestness of spirit. Goldie had meant well in encouraging her to fall in love again, but Maggie had no such expectations. The most she would allow herself to hope for was a fresh start, companionship, and a reason to pull herself out of bed in the mornings. If she did not set her sights on any more than that, then surely, she would avoid disappointment. Sighing to herself, she carried her carpetbag to the edge of the platform and looked down upon the town of Brownsville. There were plenty of passers-by in evidence, most of them going about their business with heads down and hurried steps, despite the beauty of the early summer morning. Only a few of them appeared to be waiting to meet travelers disembarking from the train. Maggie was one of a small handful of erstwhile sojourners making their final stop here in Brownsville. Perhaps that accounted for the expression of unspoken surprise on the porter's face. Brownsville was clearly quite small, though she knew it to be the county seat. Why, she doubted it was much larger than her old familiar neighborhood in New York. If folks did spend time here, it was likely to be on the way to somewhere else. Mr. Hayes must have family here, she surmised. Otherwise, what would a young, unmarried man be doing in a place like this? She shook her head again, chastising herself inwardly for such negative thoughts about her new hometown, and refocused on seeking out Mr. Colton Hayes himself. Her searching eyes fell on a couple seated in the driver's box of a small wagon. The man with the reins in his hands sat bolt upright, facing away from the platform. A broad-brimmed brown felt hat hid most of his features from view. At his side, the slight form of a woman sat, half craned backwards to watch the platform. Her hair was pinned up severely, shining white in the sunshine. Her eyes met Maggie's, and she gave a muted cry, nudging the man at her side. He turned around with alacrity, head lifting just enough that she could see his features underneath the brim of his hat, and for the first time she laid eyes on the man she was going to marry. It was hurried and brief. She had only enough time to form an impression of striking good looks and snapping black eyes before he turned away again and swung himself athletically down from the wagon. Brief as it was, the glimpse was enough to make her heart jump a little. Despite her rationalistic determination not to expect romance or love, she had allowed herself to imagine that he might be handsome, but the physical form of Colton Hayes far outweighed any of her imaginations. She felt even more shy as he approached the steps leading up to the platform. When he looked up, their eyes met, and she felt a faint shock run through her, something like a thrill. "Oh, dear." He held out a hand. "Miss Parker?" "Mrs.," she corrected him, automatically, her voice rather faint. He nodded. "Of course. My apologies." It wasn't at all what she had expected for her very first encounter with the rancher. Of course, the matrimonial agency would have made it clear that she was a widow, but perhaps he hadn't paid much attention to that fact, or perhaps he had forgotten it entirely. Either way, she felt quite thrown off course by this, and only just managed to muster a half smile. "Unnecessary, Mr. Hayes." He took her bag in one hand, hefting the heavy weight easily, and offered her the other to help her down to the ground beside him. Standing level with him, she realized that he was taller than she had first thought. Maggie herself was rather tall for a woman, standing at 5'6", but he fairly dwarfed her, her head scarcely reaching his shoulder. He was muscular, too, and broad-shouldered. Was this the form of a rancher? Of course, she would have no reason to know, but still, she couldn't help but wonder. "This way, Mrs. Parker." It sounded wrong, coming from him, and she blushed awkwardly. "Oh, please just call me Maggie. And I can call you Colton, can't I?" He stopped for a moment, eyeing her fixedly, and she was suddenly horribly certain that she'd made a mistake. But at last, all he did was give her a nod of assent and lead the way to the wagon. She was still blushing as he handed her up, swinging the carpetbag into the back. The older woman who waited there had shifted into the middle of the bench seat, allowing her plenty of space. She greeted her with a warm, friendly smile. She was somewhere around 60-odd years old, Maggie supposed, with a handsome face and a trim figure that suggested a life of hard work and activity. "Mrs. Parker." "May I call you Maggie?" Had the older woman heard the exchange? Whether she had or not, her warmth and enthusiasm was enough to take the sting out of the heat in Maggie's cheeks. She found herself relaxing a little as she sat beside the other woman. On the older woman's far side, Colton Hayes took a seat and whistled to the horses, who moved smoothly into motion. "Of course. And you must call me Alma." "Alma Hayes, Colton's ma." "I'm awful pleased to meet you, Maggie. We've been looking forward to you coming ever since the matrimonial agency sent that telegram, and I can't tell you what a joy these last few months been, fixin' up your room and gettin' ready for you. Why, the house has been a mess, but I hope you won't mind that since it's for a good reason." She laughed, and Maggie couldn't help but smile. What an odd juxtaposition there was between mother and son. Colton Hayes seemed to have gotten his mother's good looks but not her engaging personality. But surely, she told herself, it was too soon to know that for certain. She put a hand to the side of her skirts, feeling the hard lump of Gerald's pocket watch, and drew comfort from it. She had no expectations of love, only of companionship. She had agreed to the arrangement of the matrimonial agency. If her new husband was handsome but aloof, then she had no one to blame but herself. After all, this had been her own idea. Chapter 2. It wasn't until Maggie laid her head on the pillow in the guest bedroom in the little ranch house that she fully realized just how exhausted she was. It was only natural, she thought sleepily, considering the stress of the last few months, and the travel she had endured, and then she was asleep, before she could soothe herself any further. She slept straight through the night and into the next morning, awakening only when the sun was well up over the horizon. A quick fumble for Gerald's pocket watch on the nightstand told her that it was after 9 o'clock. She leapt from bed and then hesitated, feeling torn between a guilty instinct that told her to rush downstairs and present herself to the world, and a strange reluctance to face this new world of strangers. Her sense of duty, fueled by guilt, won out. A quick wash in the basin, a change of clothing, and she made her way downstairs toward the kitchen. Alma had shown her around the house the night before, but she had been in such a state of exhaustion that she was surprised to find how much of the tour she had retained. The upstairs housed 4 bedrooms, Alma's, Colton's, the guest room that was now Maggie's, and a 4th that had gone unlabeled. Downstairs, there was a small study and library tucked at the rear of the house. The hallway split the rest of the home in 2, with a large, comfortable sitting room on one side and the equally large, even more comfortable kitchen on the other. This late in the morning, Maggie wasn't sure what to expect, but she discovered Alma seated at the kitchen table, poring over a large ledger. The older woman looked up with a smile and got to her feet. For the first time, Maggie realized that Alma had a limp, something clearly causing her pain as she stepped forward, but she didn't appear willing to let it stop her. "Ah, there you are. I had hoped that you would get plenty of sleep, my dear. After a trip like that, you needed it. And you were half dead on your feet last night, poor thing. Sit down, I'll fetch you some coffee and breakfast." "Oh, I'd be glad to." "Nonsense." Alma waved her objections away and steered her toward a chair. "I'm just going over the accounts. They're never ending, it seems, but I'm used to them. My late husband hated them and always asked me to keep the books for him. Difficult, on a small ranch like this, to make ends meet at times, but we're not doing too badly, and I'll be honest with you on that. After all, you're soon to be part of the family yourself." She smiled broadly, and Maggie smiled back. This was meant as a reassurance, she knew. Still, her mind went to Colton Hayes and the rather distant, aloof manner he'd displayed the night before. Even with a good night's sleep behind her, she couldn't escape the worry that she might have made a mistake. But Alma's reassurance, even without knowing it, was heartening. "Tell me about your husband," she said, accepting the cup of coffee and plate of bacon and eggs with a grateful smile. "I know so little about your family, the matrimonial agency didn't give me much." As she ate her breakfast and drank 3 cups of very good coffee, Alma gave her the family history. The ranch, it turned out, had been started by James Hayes' father, Colton's paternal grandfather. It was a relatively small plot for the area, with only a few hundred head of cattle, and had seen its ups and downs over the years. These days, it was prosperous enough that Colton had hired on 2 hands to help him with the herd. That was what convinced him that it was time to get married, after all, Alma said cheerfully. Before that, he was leery of taking on a wife and a family. "What if times were hard," he used to say, "and I always told him that the good Lord would provide." I suppose he finally made up his mind to believe his old ma. "Convinced him?" Maggie repeated. "He wasn't sure that he ought to marry, then?" "Oh, he's wanted to. He's 33, you know, and most of the boys he grew up with have wives and children of their own already." But he was off gallivanting, she chuckled suddenly. "No, that's not fair. He's always been a hard worker, has Colton. It's just that he didn't think ranching was for him. When he turned 20, he went out west to become a prospector. For years, we didn't see him, though he wrote letters regular every month, and sent back some of the gold he found, too. I kept waitin' for him to send the word that he'd found a girl out in California, but I reckon any girl who would put up with a mining shack in the wilderness would have to be tough as nails, and like as not she would be too busy prospecting for herself. She chuckled, and Maggie joined in. He was a prospector, then. What brought him back to the ranch? Alma was quiet for a moment, long enough that Maggie wondered if she had said something wrong. The older woman's smile remained, but it grew sad, somehow, and her eyes wandered toward the window beyond Maggie's shoulder. Jimmy, she said. We lost Jimmy. Maggie held her breath. She knew enough to know that she didn't need to question this. The answer was coming, in Alma's own time. My husband passed away a few years after Colton headed west. He came home for the funeral, of course, but his brother assured him that he could take care of the ranch. And he could. Jimmy was my younger boy, just as hard a worker as Colton, but more the stay-at-home type. He loved the land they grew up on and had none of the need for adventure that his older brother was so full of. He took over running the ranch, and we did well enough for a long time. But just last year, she bit her lip. Impulsively, Maggie reached out to touch the older woman's hand, pressing down, hoping that she could give her some comfort. Alma took a deep breath and mustered up another smile, faltering though it was. I reckon grief still catches you unawares, sometimes, long after you figure you're done with it. Yes, Maggie said softly, I believe it does. It was an accident, all sudden-like. There was a rainstorm, and he went out to clothe in the horses. Well, lightning struck nearby, and they went wild. I found him out there, in the mud of the corral, hardly breathing. Dragged him back inside and did what I could, but I couldn't reach the doctor and there wouldn't have been much he could have done for him anyhow. I sent word to Colton, of course, but poor Jimmy, well, he went to sleep, the next day, and he never woke up. Maggie squeezed her hand, her heart in her throat, but the older woman took another deep breath and lifted her chin. There was a strength in Alma Hayes that Maggie had never seen in anyone. Colton came as soon as ever he could, but of course Jimmy was buried by then. All that was left was me, and the running of the ranch in shambles. Good man that he is, he pitched in with a will and we're comin' out of the troubles now. But I reckon he still hasn't quite gotten over his own sadness, that he never got to say goodbye to his brother. She went on, her voice softening. There's a particular heaviness to a man's grief. Women's tears lighten the load, but for a man like Colton, it's an indulgence he can't allow himself. I reckon it's best not to mention Jimmy, not until you've come to know him. I don't know what he'll do. Of course, Maggie said softly. I do understand grief, Alma, in my own way. The thought of the months of weeping, in the wake of Gerald's death, flashed upon her like a flood, and she shook the pain away hastily. I reckon you do, Alma said, squeezing her hand in return. That's Jimmy's tree out there in the yard. That was how Colton buried his brother, when he couldn't be here for the funeral. Planted a strong, healthy sprig of an apple tree, and takes care of it as though it's a child of his own. Maggie turned to follow Alma's gaze. The young tree was little more than a sapling, but in the warmth of early spring, it already had a few blossoms on its slim branches. It made her smile, even as it tugged at her heart. That's a lovely gesture, she said. I wish I'd been able to do such a thing after Gerald. It didn't take much more than a little coaxing, and another cup of coffee, for Maggie to tell Alma the story of her husband and how she had lost him after such a brief marriage. Alma was large-hearted, though she didn't give way to tears when thinking of her own lost son. There was a suspicious moisture in those dark eyes, so like Colton's, by the end of Maggie's story. Their shared tragedy seemed to complete the bridge that had been started between them simply by Alma's friendliness. By the end of the morning, Maggie felt as though she'd known the older woman her entire life. Alma bent so far as to allow her to help set out things for luncheon. It was a simple meal, as supper was the largest of the day, but Colton needed a reason to take a break, she explained, and this was all that would do. Bread, cheese, coffee, lemonade, and Maggie and Alma were seated again at the table, deep in discussion, when the kitchen door opened, and Colton stepped inside. Maggie closed her mouth so suddenly that she nearly bit her tongue, sitting up straight. There was something about Colton's appearance that made her nerves suddenly begin to jangle, It wasn't as though he was frowning at her or glaring at her, but the small half-smile, which seemed like mere politeness, made her feel as though he was. Once again, she was struck by the difference between mother and son, but the story of how he had lost his brother, and so recently, made her more conscious of the fact that she did not know him well at all. Perhaps he was being as friendly as he knew how, under the circumstances. Maggie. He gave her a nod. Colton, she returned. Did you sleep well? Very well, thank you. A pause, and she felt like twisting a little in agony. He glanced at his mother, who was beaming at him as though he were a child taking his first steps. Good, he managed at last, and sat down abruptly. The rest of the meal went a bit more smoothly, largely due to the chatter of his mother. Alma asked him question after question about daily chores, explaining each one to Maggie as they were discussed. She wasn't surprised to find that there was a great deal to be done in the running of a ranch, but couldn't help but express her admiration for the men who were handling it all. You must end every day exhausted, she said at last, shaking her head with a smile. Your mother said that you had hired some help, only wonder that you don't need more. 2 is about all that's required, he said gruffly. And about all we can afford, besides. Well, I don't know anything about running a ranch, of course, but I'm a quick learner. I'd be glad to lend a hand, if you think I'd be of any help. She faltered at the last, feeling suddenly that she had overstepped herself somehow. Colton opened his mouth to respond, closed it again, and sent a quick glance at his mother, who smiled at him. He tried again. I reckon the men and I can handle it just fine, he said, and paused. Thank you. Maggie nodded, fighting off the blush that seemed inevitable in the wake of this exchange. A desperate glance at Alma told the older woman of her plight, and Alma jumped in willingly. I'll take you with me to milk the cows tomorrow morning, she said. I'm sure we'd all be glad to have you help, and it's awful nice that you're willing, so soon after you arrived. I'll be glad to have an extra pair of hands in running this house, make no mistake. I told you it was a bit of a mess. Oh, not at all, I think it's lovely. Alma beamed. Well, there's always something else to be done. Just as soon as I get done with one task, 3 more have piled up. The laundry mounts up something dreadful, especially after a hard rain like we had last week. And the attic needs clearing out. Everything we don't use gets put up there, and it's a hodgepodge of a mess. I'd be glad to help with anything, Maggie assured her, but Colton spoke up. I don't reckon anyone needs to be up in the attic. His voice was strangely sharp, drawing the attention of both Maggie and his mother. His expression, too, was harder than usual. Now, Colton, his mother began. That attic's been left alone for years. No call to go disturbing it now. He stood up abruptly, setting his fork down in his plate with a clatter. Without another word, he set the plate in the wash basin and left through the kitchen door. He did not slam it behind him, but Maggie suspected this was more out of deference to his mother than anything else. The 2 women were left behind to stare wordlessly at each other for a moment. Then Alma shook her head. He put Jimmy's things up there, she said. Not to mention several decades worth of items we haven't used or even seen in just as long, but I reckon it's his brother's possessions that made him so snappish. Well, never you mind, Maggie. It's my house, too, and if you're willing to help, then I'm just as willing to put you to work. She stood up and began to collect plates, and Maggie emulated her. As she went to fetch water to wash the dishes, she couldn't help but wonder what awaited her in the attic, and what Colton Hayes might do or say, when he found out that she had ventured inside. Chapter 3. The town of Brownsville had counted on being through with spring and well on its way to summer, but the weather evidently had other ideas. Despite Alma's dearly held hope that the pile of laundry might diminish as the sunny days continued, allowing herself and Maggie to hang it out to dry, not 2 more days had passed before the former rainstorms returned and took over the landscape, turning the May days into gray days. A rumble of thunder presaged the storms only shortly before the clouds opened and emptied themselves on the world. The ranch was situated up a slight rise in the land, made up of rolling meadows that were ideal for the roaming cattle. The foothills of the mountain range sat just beyond, with a river furnishing irrigation for crops and water for the cows. Further into the valley, Brownsville itself sat astride the river. The earlier rain had swollen the watercourse and saturated the ground. This newest round of storms sent a veritable flood of water coursing through the town, nearly knocking out the stone bridge and stranding one side of town away from the other. Even worse, nearby creeks grew swollen and rough, and the nearest neighbors of the Hayes family were forced to leave their homes behind to seek the safety of higher ground. "Don't you worry," Alma told Maggie, "Colton will bring them through safe enough. There's plenty of room for them, too. The Cartwright family are our nearest neighbors, and the Smiths just beyond them, down the hill a little way. Their place will be hit the hardest, I reckon. But we'll put the Cartwright boys in the loft of the barn, and the rest of them will just about fit here in the house. And we've got provisions enough to keep everyone fed for a week, praise be. So don't you worry a bit." Despite her words, there was no missing the worried crease between her brows, and Maggie knew that there was more to this concern than just the storm itself. It wasn't until the neighbors appeared that she started to understand the source of Alma's unspoken worry. Colton went out, head bowed low against the torrential rain, and collected them all. He arrived back in the middle of a brief break in the storm, when a watery-eyed sun shone misleadingly from behind the scurrying clouds. Even to Maggie's untrained eye, it was clear that there was another round on the way. Both the Cartwright family, 4 boys, Maggie realized with widening eyes, a laughing, boisterous father, and a harried-looking mother, and the Smiths were packed into the back of the wagon, apart from 2 figures who sat beside Colton in the driver's box. The slight figure between Colton and the other adults seemed like a child, at first. She assumed that it must be the youngest of the Smiths. She wasn't wrong, not entirely. But it wasn't until the girl was helped down from the wagon and half carried into the house that Maggie got a good look at her and realized that she was no child. Her parents, introduced to her as Beulah and Michael Smith, hovered over the young woman protectively. Maggie could understand why. It was clear that she was in ill health, and chronically so. After the last few months of Gerald's life, Maggie knew the signs all too well. But when Alma put an arm around her and led her forward to introduce her to Maggie, the young woman gave a smile as warm and lively as any that Maggie had ever seen. "Oh, I'm so pleased to meet you. Alma told me all the news when Colton wrote for a bride, and Ma passed it on when she heard you were coming. When did you arrive?" "A week ago. I'm awful sorry, Maggie, that I didn't get by to meet you sooner. You're so very welcome to our little town of Brownsville, and we're all delighted to have you. Will you please call me Rosie? Ma named me after her mother, Rosalind, but I like my friends to call me Rosie." She clasped Maggie's hand in hers. "And we will be friends, won't we?" The way that Rosie Smith smiled up at Maggie made her heart swell a little. There was such simple joy in existence there, and yet that youthful face had been ravaged by pain, and Maggie suspected that her age was not at all what it appeared. Perhaps she was even a few years younger than Maggie herself, though the lines on her thin, pale face suggested a decade or more advanced than that. She was very slight and delicate, too, making Maggie feel a positive giant in comparison. She felt the strong urge to take the girl in her arms and give her a fierce embrace, as though they had known each other forever. Instead, she clasped those thin, delicate hands in both of hers and said, warmly, "Of course we will, Rosie. Why, I feel as though we are friends already." She caught a glimpse of Alma's face and was glad to see the look of pleased approval there. The Cartwright boys were shuffled unceremoniously into the barn, with Alma doling out glasses of lemonade and blankets for them to spend the rest of the afternoon in lazy comfort. Their father, laughing uproariously at something one of his progenies had said, decided to spend the night with them, and Maggie couldn't help but note that Mrs. Cartwright appeared rather relieved at this proposal. Alma led each guest to their allocated spot. Maggie volunteered to give up her room to the Smiths. Mrs. Cartwright took the final spare room, and Maggie was given blankets to make up a mattress on the floor, while Rosie Smith was veritably deluged in all the pillows and blankets that Alma could spare, with the settee in the living room, before the fire, designated as her resting place. Supper was a cheerful, if crowded occasion, with many expressions of gratitude for the bravery and readiness of Colton to spring into action on behalf of his neighbors. He ducked his head as though shy, but Maggie spotted his grin. It was, she realized with a small thrill running through her, a very appealing look on him. As the reins moved back in, the Cartwright males scampered off back to the barn, and everyone began to settle down for the night. It was more obvious than ever why Alma had worried about the neighbors, specifically the Smiths. To watch the drawn, weary face of Rosie's parents, Maggie knew that their lives were a constant stream of illnesses and setbacks. She left them together in the sitting room and went into the kitchen to find Alma leaning over the stove, her eyes closed in weariness. "Alma?" At the sound of Maggie's voice, her friend came alive again, turning to her with a ready smile. "Are you quite sure you'll be comfortable here in the kitchen? I've put a rug down for you, but perhaps the sitting room might be better, still." "No, I'll be all right. Unless Rosie needs someone to sleep near her." Alma looked up at once. "Would you mind terribly?" "She does all right, I think, but it would ease Beulah's mind, I'm sure." And it would obviously ease Alma's mind, too, Maggie thought. She nodded assent. "Of course I don't mind. Rosie is awfully sweet." Is she? She could not think of the correct way to ask the question without seeming nosy, but Alma knew what she meant. "The doctor says she's not long for this world," she said sadly, turning back to the stove. "Of course, he said that for years now, ever since she was a little girl." "What do doctors know?" "How old is she?" 28, I believe." "Oh. It's a surprise, isn't it?" Alma glanced at her swiftly. "It can be difficult to tell, I'm sure. She's so small, sometimes she looks just like a child, and then the pain clouds her eyes, and you can see that she's dealt with far more than any sweet girl should have to deal with. And stayed strong through it, too. They've taken her to all the specialists they could find, even traveled back to Boston. But no one was ever able to give them any answers. And these days, she seemed even weaker than usual." "Poor Rosie," Maggie whispered. "And her poor parents. It's a shame for all of us," Alma said, "not to take away from their sorrow or their loss. Rosie is one of the sweetest and best that Brownsville has ever managed to produce." Her smile turned a bit wry. "There were a few moments, when she was younger, that I was half certain she and Jimmy would. Well, there's no point thinking of what might have been, is there?" She turned back to the stove again, briskly stirring it up, though it was late in the evening by now, and there was nothing to be baked or cooked. It was just a gesture to distract herself from the sorrow she'd endured in life, Maggie knew, for she recognized the motion. She'd done it often enough herself, after Gerald had died. "Rosie will be delighted to share the sitting room with you, Maggie, only don't be surprised if she wants to sit up half the night talking. Poor girl, she doesn't get out of the house much these days." Rosie did, indeed, want to talk, but not long had passed in their cheerful conversation before the young woman began to nod off. Maggie trailed off during a story about growing up in the city, lowering her voice to a murmur, letting it lull the other girl into a deeper sleep. She needed the rest, that much was clear. The danger and excitement of the day, the worry over the house they had fled, clearly had taken its toll. It had taken its toll on everyone, really, she thought sleepily, and then she was drifting off herself, while the rain pounded away overhead. Chapter 4. The rains passed off the next afternoon, and Colton loaded up the wagon again to take his neighbors back to their homes. It was on the tip of Maggie's tongue to ask to come with him. After only knowing Rosie and her parents for less than 24 hours, she felt rather protective over the girl, and wanted badly to accompany her home and ensure that everything was all right. But the wagon was overloaded and the horses dragging even as it was, and so she contented herself with giving Rosie a fond embrace. The young woman looked up at her with a smile. Despite the deep shadows around her eyes, there was a warm light inside them, and she seemed as though she was always lit from within. "You will come and visit me, won't you, Maggie?" "Of course I will. As soon as I can." "Good. I'll look forward to it." Maggie stood with Alma on the front porch, watching and waving as the wagon load of friendly neighbors jolted down the road. "I do hope that everything is all right," Alma murmured. "Does it flood often here?" "We'll get a little standing water just about every spring. But we're prepared for it, usually. This is later than usual." I hope the weather didn't put it on special on my account." Her tone was teasing, striving to lighten the mood, and lighten Alma's spirits, and the older woman responded in kind, turning to Maggie with a chuckle and putting an arm around her waist. "Well, no matter what happens, Colton will help them sort it out," she said. "I reckon he'll tell us all about it when he comes back for supper." Colton was late in returning, and Maggie surmised from the rather grim look on his face that more damage had been done than anyone had dared to hope. Over a plate of stew, he filled them in. The Cartwrights' barn got the worst of it. They had let the horses out into the corral, thank goodness, but even so they were hock-deep in mud. I told Fred he ought to dig drainage ditches away from the building, but he always was a great one for ignoring advice. Maybe this time he'll change his mind about it. "And the Smiths," his mother pressed. Colton shook his head. "The house wasn't too bad," he said slowly. "A little damage at the back, near the kitchen door. Flooded the flagstones. It's mucky as all get out around the doors, though, and the barn. Mike'll have a time getting the wagon out if he needs it in a hurry." Maggie held her breath. The reason for a hurry, of course, would be an emergency, like that of the flood, of course, which had come on too quickly, but she was certain that Colton had another sort of emergency in mind, and it was to do with Rosie's failing health. How terrible it would be for Rosie to desperately need the help of a doctor and yet no one would be able to go and fetch one or get her to town in time. "They need a few ditches dug themselves," Colton went on. "And a little help clearing away the mud. I told him I'd be back tomorrow, shovels in hand, and I won't leave until it's done." "The work here," his mother said, but Colton cut her off. "Russell and Taze can handle it. I won't be away more than a few days." Alma offered no other objection, nodding instead. It was a display of absolute trust, and it touched Maggie's heart. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked desperately. "If I can be of any help to Rosie and her family, please, please let me." Colton turned to her, his eyes fixing on hers. He seemed poised to cut her off as quickly as he had done to his mother, but a moment of silence fell over the room while he looked her over, seeming to read through her lines and discern the earnestness of her offer. She felt a blush coming on at the intensity of his regard, but refused to look away, instead meeting his gaze as calmly as she could. "It's hard work." "I'm not afraid of hard work," she said. "The most difficult thing is to stand idly by when I might be of some help." "I'm willing, Colton." Another moment, and then he nodded, even as he said, "You'd best stay here and help Ma. I could put you to work there, it's true, but you're more used to me here on the ranch. Ma knows some of the chores, she used to handle them back when." He broke off suddenly, biting his lip, and she knew that he had been about to mention his brother. "Back when Jimmy ran the ranch." Instead, he said, "Before. Her hips been both airin' her more than usual, and I reckon she'd be glad of the extra pair of hands." A quick glance at his mother, who nodded. She didn't even contest his comment about the pain in her hip, and, Maggie knew, this must mean that it was more serious than she had realized. He wasn't just fobbing her off, thinking her useless because she was a woman and a stranger to the area. No, he had given her true consideration, weighed out where she would be most useful, and asked her to abide by his judgment. If his mother trusted that judgment, then surely, she could do no less. "All right," she said. "Please, please give Rosie my love and tell her that I still promise to come and see her when I can." There was a look in his eyes as he nodded assent that she had not seen from him before. She thought it might be appreciation, and perhaps even respect. When she arose the next morning, he was already gone, along with the wagon. Maggie gulped down a cup of steaming hot coffee, scalding her tongue, and then hastily followed Alma out into the gray light of early dawn. It was going to be a beautiful day, she could tell. The skies were clear as crystal, warming from that vague silver to a translucent blue. It would be fine weather for all the work that Colton needed to do on behalf of the Smiths, and all the work that she and Alma needed to do right here at the ranch. This early in the morning, with the air still rather cool, it was clear that Alma's hip was bothering her more than usual. She hobbled quickly, however, and Maggie followed her from one end of the barn to the other, learning the ins and outs of milking the cows, distributing hay, pumping water, dishing out oats, and all the other details that kept life on the ranch running smoothly. It wasn't until after the animals were all fed that the humans could fill their own feed bags. Alma called a hello to the two ranch hands, who had just arrived to care for their work that day and led the way back to the kitchen. "May I make breakfast?" Maggie asked quickly. "I've got to get a bit more practice with that gargantuan stove of yours." Her aim, of course, was to see Alma seated and resting comfortably, but the older woman was far too independent to give in to a mere suggestion that she take it easy. Maggie had a feeling that Alma could see right through her delicate machinations but gave in all the same. It was a testament to the pain she was under that she agreed without making a fuss, and she took a seat at the table to oversee productions. The day proceeded as normal after that. The two of them laughed and chatted over breakfast. It was only when Alma mentioned that it had been nearly 2 weeks since Maggie's arrival that the realization sank into Maggie's mind and heart. Here for 2 weeks almost, and Colton had not said a word about when their engagement would take the next step forward. He hadn't even suggested that they talk about setting the date for their wedding. Throughout the days since she had met him, she had wondered now and then whether she might have somehow made a mistake. Was it possible that he felt the exact same way? It wasn't fair to ask his mother, she knew. Alma was touchingly delighted with her company, and to suggest that they might be parted because of the dissolution of her engagement to Colton would surely hurt the older woman as much as her hip pained her. No, best that she addresses it with Colton himself, when he returned from helping the Smiths. Though the day was beautiful, there were relatively few chores to be done after breakfast. Maggie fed the chickens while Alma seated herself in the garden with a sigh and began to pull weeds. Maggie watched her friend for a moment, a fond smile on her lips. "Alma, do you suppose today would be a good day for me to return to the attic? I haven't been able to do much clearing out since I started." Alma glanced up, a thoughtful look on her face. "Well," she said slowly, "Colton is gone for at least a day or two." She smiled brightly. "I think that's an excellent idea, my dear." With an answering grin, Maggie left Alma to her work and returned indoors. She had started the job of clearing out the attic shortly after her arrival, with Alma's blessing even if without Colton's agreement. Thus far she had not found much: a trunk of clothing that she suspected had belonged to Alma's husband, a 3-legged chair and a small table both in need of repair, and other miscellaneous household items that had outgrown their use at the time, but which were kept for the traditional reason of, just in case. As the sunlight shifted outside the narrow attic window, Maggie delved back into the depths of the items there. She felt that she was learning almost as much about the Hayes family here in the attic as she had learned from Alma and Colton themselves. Certainly Colton had not had much to share. As she picked methodically through another trunk, her mind fell back to wondering whether Colton was having second thoughts about their wedding. She supposed she couldn't blame him, if he was. Hadn't she gone through the same thing herself? But it seemed painful, somehow, to imagine him calling their engagement off entirely. It made her heart clench. And then again, there were the few moments when she had caught him looking at her, that unreadable expression in his dark eyes. And the way he had looked at her the night before, when she had told him staunchly that she was not afraid of hard work. In the middle of the trunk, she found a small box. Pulling it out and lifting the lid, she discovered that it was full to the brim with letters, the envelopes yellowed with age. The handwriting was rather clumsy and round, male handwriting, if she knew anything about it. And so, it proved to be, for the letters were from Colton himself, directed to his mother. She smiled as she read through a few of them. Her conscience bothered only momentarily. After all, what would Colton say to his mother that she herself could not be privy to? It wasn't as though she'd stumbled on someone's love letters. These were brief, though there were many of them, and full of details about the everyday life of a miner in California. Exhaustion was clear in some of them, hopelessness in others, and yet the drive to continue permeated each one. As she paged through the envelopes, she found one that seemed rather heavier than the rest. Tipping the envelope up, it disgorged a sizable nugget of gold which landed in her palm with a warmth and weight that took her by surprise. For a moment, she gaped at it, eyes wide. Gold. Yes, hadn't Alma said that Colton sent back some of the gold he found, to support his family? She couldn't help but smile at this. His love for the family he had left behind was obvious, for what hopeful young prospector would so willingly part with something so valuable? And how strange to find it here in the attic, along with the letters. Surely, he had intended it to be put to use for the running of the ranch. Driven by curiosity now, she made her way back down to the front door, out and around the house. Alma, Alma. At first all she could see was the older woman's legs, sprawled in the midst of the garden. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she ran forward, shoving the gold into her pocket to have her hands free. To her relief, Alma half turned as she approached, her voice so weak that Maggie couldn't understand what she was saying. It was only when she got on her knees beside her that she heard the murmur of, "Twisted, fell, can't get up." Maggie helped her gently to sit, though Alma's weathered face was deeply grimaced with pain. "Don't try to move," she urged her. "I'll go for Taze and Russell." "Please, sit still, Alma." The look on Alma's face suggested that she would be forced to do as she was told, even if her instinct was to try to get to her feet all on her own. She wouldn't have been able to manage it, Maggie was certain. The way her leg was twisted. Her heart was still beating wildly when she returned with both the ranch hands accompanying her. Between the two of them, they hoisted Alma up easily and carried her into the house, seating her gently on the settee in the sitting room. Maggie propped Alma's foot up on a cushion, though she wasn't at all certain what else should be done. To her relief, Russell said, "I'll fetch the doctor," without being asked, and raced off at once. Dr. McKinnon was there within the hour. An examination ensued which caused such pain to Alma that she clutched Maggie's hand in a grip like death, moaning as the doctor moved and shifted the joint. In the end, he stood up straight and nodded down at her. "For years, I've been tellin' you ought to be more careful, Alma. Well, it's caught up with you. It's a twisted ankle, of course, but that hip was out of joint, too. I've got it back as good as I can, but I don't know that it will heal straight unless you keep off it for the next few weeks. Let that be a warning to you." He darted a swift glance at Maggie, and she knew that it was a warning to her, as well. If she didn't keep Alma in line, there was a good chance that she wouldn't regain the ability to walk at all. "I'll care for her," she promised. "She's taught me well." "All right, then," said the doctor, still sternly. "I'll be back tomorrow to take a look at you, Alma. Don't go gettin' in any trouble between now and then, eh?" Alma closed her eyes. No promises were made. But Maggie swore to herself that she would do everything within her power to see that Alma recovered as best as she could. It wasn't until after the doctor had left, and Russell had returned to see what his employer's mother might need, that the suggestion of fetching Colton from the Smiths was made. At this, Alma opened her eyes. "Now, Russell Cody, you know better than that. Colton doesn't need to come rushin' home because his silly old ma twisted her ankle. No, you don't breathe a word to him. He'll be home in a few days, and that's plenty of time to find out something like this." She took Maggie's hand, beseechingly. "You'll be all right with the chores for a few days, won't you, Maggie? As soon as I'm able, I'll be up and hobblin' around to help you." Maggie squeezed her hand, smiling down at her. "Don't you worry for a minute, Alma," she said. "We'll be just fine." She was caught between relief that Colton would not return right away, and anxiety that he would still be gone for the next few days. With the help of the ranch hands, who were always willing to drop whatever they were doing and come to carry Alma wherever she needed to go, she managed well enough on her own. But by the end of the next few days, she was exhausted. "I don't know how you did it for so long," she told Alma, who gave a good-natured chuckle. "I always had the help I needed, my dear. And when you are the mistress of the house, you'll have the help you need, too. Colton will see to that." Maggie turned her eyes away, taking a seat beside her friend with a sigh. "I only hope that I can fill your shoes, Alma." That wasn't all she hoped, of course. The casual mention of Maggie as the mistress of the household, the wife of the ranch's owner, stirred up all sorts of feelings and doubts. She still found herself half dreading the day that Colton returned, and half longing for it. But when it did happen, it was so suddenly upon her that she scarcely had the time to analyze how she felt. One moment, as she worked in the kitchen, she spotted the wagon going by at a fast clip, headed for the barn. The next, Colton himself was bursting through the door, wild-eyed and hatless. "Where's my mother?" Maggie gulped. "In the sitting room." He advanced on her, his brow thunderous, and seized her hands in his. His grip was not hard, but it was warm and urgent, and she felt a thrill run through her from her head to her toes. Is she all right? Why didn't you send for me at once? There was a catch in his voice, unexpectedly, a roughness, and she looked up to meet his eyes, realizing that the urgency was due to worry, rather than anger. She swallowed hard and nodded. She'll be fine, she said, doing her best to reassure him. The doctor said she needs to rest, that's all. Her leg was twisted, and she fell in the garden. But she'll be just fine. She didn't want us to send for you, there was no real danger, once we got her back into the house. He closed his eyes for a moment, and took a deep breath before letting go of her hands. She followed him down the hallway to the sitting room and stood in the doorway, watching as he got to his knees before his mother, his tone low. She could hear the echoes of frantic worry mingling with his chastisement, and Alma smiled down at him affectionately. Everything's going to be just fine, Colton, she told him, smoothing his tumbled dark hair away from his brow. Why, Maggie has taken care of it all, just as though she were born to run a ranch. And the doctor says I'll be back on my feet in no time. Colton turned, his eyes meeting Maggie's once more. Mixed with the wariness that was so familiar to her by now, there was another emotion that she could not identify. But all he said was, "Thank you." She bowed her head in acknowledgement and went away, returning to the kitchen to occupy herself and allow the mother and son time to talk. It wasn't until then that she realized why Colton had been so frantic with worry, so instantly angry that he had not been told about his mother's fall. After all, he had been away from home before when he'd lost a family member unexpectedly, and had not returned until well after his brother was buried. He'd lost a great deal through being away. It was no wonder that he should fear it happening again, even though he was only a few miles away from home. His feelings did him credit. He loved his mother dearly and was only too painfully aware of the fact that he was her last support. She felt a familiar weight in her skirt pocket and reached into it to caress the solid curve of Gerald's watch. To her surprise, though, it was not the cool, hard surface of the watch she felt, but instead something rough and pebbled to the touch, though just as heavy as the watch itself. She pulled the nugget of gold from her pocket and held it in her palm, wonderingly. It wasn't the same object that she had carried with her all the way from New York, but somehow, it brought the same sort of comfort. Chapter 5. The rains were finally over for the year, it seemed. One sunny day followed on the heels of the next, an endless cavalcade of beauty. Each new afternoon seemed a few degrees warmer than the last, and Maggie had a feeling that she would soon find out what summer felt like here in Wyoming. Surely it could not be as stifling as the summer heat on the streets of New York City, she told herself, but she knew that it was merely a hope rather than an expectation. She wrote letters to her sister and her family, describing the newness of her surroundings and the people of Brownsville, whom she was getting to know little by little. Once or twice in the first month after her arrival, she drove the wagon into town to collect supplies. Often, Colton brought things home after his own outings. He never failed to ask his mother if she had a list for him each time he went into town, and it wasn't long before he took to asking Maggie, too. After all, with Alma still laid up, Maggie had taken over the running of the household. Colton said little about it, but she did catch him watching her with that unfathomable expression in his eyes. She suspected that it was gratitude. A few days after his return from his work at the Smiths, she finally had a chance to ask him about Rosie and her parents. He had stepped in for a bite of lunch, which she had prepared for him. Alma was resting in her room upstairs, suffering from a headache. Maggie hesitated, wondering whether she ought to leave Colton to his own devices or sit down beside him, but the rarity of the opportunity to speak with him alone was too much to pass up, and she pulled a chair out and sat down swiftly. In response to her question, he glanced up from his plate, his attention diverted. "Oh, they're all right, I suppose. I reckon they could be worse, all things considered." "Is all the work done that needs to be done, then?" "For now," he allowed. "I'd like to see Mike bring on a little extra help, but times are hard, and I can't blame him for trying to scrimp and save. I'll get over there to finish the ditches when I can spare a few hours." "I wish I could be of more help," she said quietly. "I know that I don't know the family well, but, well, Rosie is the sort of person who goes straight to your heart, isn't she?" A rare smile warmed his face. "That she is," he said softly. And I reckon she felt the same way about you, Maggie. Do you think so? Kept a skin about you, he said, returning his attention to his plate self-consciously. A skin, how you liked it here, whether you missed New York, and when we were likely to be wed. She caught her breath. A question that she had not dared to ask herself, and yet Rosie Smith, with all her fragility, had been fearless in asking it for her. And what did you tell her? She managed. He glanced up at her, and their eyes met. She took in a deep, slow breath, trying to calm her racing heart. I told her that we hadn't had a chance to discuss it yet, he said. Maggie nodded, biting her lip. This was true, at least, though she still wasn't sure how he felt about it. Nothing in his tone or expression gave his feelings away. She wondered if he could tell how she felt, simply by the look on her face. She's very sweet, to take such an interest. She wants to attend the wedding, Colton said heavily. And she's afraid she won't be. He cut himself off, suddenly, and simply looked down at his plate, making no move to eat anything further. Maggie found herself almost overcome by the urge to reach out and put a hand over his. She stopped herself just in time, instead reaching a hand into her pocket, where the heavy weight of the golden nugget there caught her attention. Colton, she said swiftly, I've been meaning to ask you. I came across a box of your mother's. She kept all your letters. Any moment now he was going to demand why she had still been in the attic when he had told her not to. She pressed on hurriedly, anxious to avoid any confrontation on the subject. Something heavy fell out, and I wondered if you knew what it might be. It wasn't entirely true, but neither was it a lie. She handed the gold nugget over to him and he took it, his mild irritation dissipating at the distraction. Holding it in his palm, he turned it over with his pointer finger, and she was utterly moved to see the transformation that a genuine smile made to his handsome face. Why, I reckon this is the very first bit of gold I found, he said. I recognize the shape. I sent it back here to Ma along with a letter to tell her that I was making my fortune after all. He glanced up at her, and the smile remained. It made her heart skip a few beats with the trueness of it. Here, at last, she had found a memory that did not bring him pain. Took me a few months. A lot of hours and a lot of doubt. But then, he shook his head, turning it over again. I figured they would spend it. They ought to have. The good Lord knew that they needed the money. But here it is. She kept it, Maggie said softly. She must have known how much it meant to you. It meant that my luck was changing, Colton said softly. That better times were ahead. They sat together in silence, but the silence for once was companionable, rather than awkward or painful. She watched him, his pensive face drawn in deep thought. How handsome he was, she thought, and how unexpected he was, too. Everything he did came as a surprise. Especially the way he was with her now, after the strangeness of their relationship to date, engaged, but hardly able to speak to each other. Living under the roof but not spending any time together. And she, helplessly falling in love with him a little more with every passing day. And Colton, well, his true emotions remained a mystery. She hoped that she would have the chance, someday, to understand them. Halfway afraid that his mind would lead him along the garden path back toward the pain of losing his brother, the fear of losing his mother, she spoke up abruptly, breaking the silence. Colton, might we invite the Smiths over someday soon for supper? I did tell Rosie that I would visit her, but I suspect that it might be a bit easier on her and her mother to come here instead. Colton nodded. Sure, we could do that. Ma would like it, too. She smiled at him. How easy he could be, sometimes. If only he were that easy all the time instead of only rarely, then she wouldn't have shied away from asking him about their engagement. The question was still foremost on her mind, but she was unwilling to risk the comfort between them at this moment to ask it right now. Besides, she had visitors to prepare for. As she returned to her duties, leaving him finishing up his lunch at the table, she realized that she had never been quite so content as she was in that moment. For once, it seemed that there was everything good to look forward to. And the tragedies of the past need not overshadow the joy of the future. Chapter 6. It felt like a golden hour, Maggie thought, with a shine as any nugget of California gold. Here they were, crowded but comfortably arranged around the kitchen table. Colton had brought down the three-legged chairs from the attic for the occasion and mended them enough to withstand being used for the evening. Beulah and Michael Smith sat beside each other on one side, smiling benevolently. Alma was in a seat of honor at the foot of the table, her healing leg propped up carefully to avoid inadvertent jostling. Rosie and Maggie sat across from the Smiths. To Maggie's left sat Colton, at the head of the table. He was smiling, too, it seemed, more smiles than Maggie had ever seen from him, that was a certainty. It made her heart do a little somersault each time she caught his eye. This was what family should be like, she thought, nothing but joyful, cheerful chatter, good food, and perhaps a little chaos thrown in, but all of it blanketed in love. It made her miss Gerald suddenly, with an ache that was fierce in her throat, and she blinked back tears, hoping that no one would notice. No one did, no one was looking, but somehow, Rosie knew. The young woman, more pale than ever and frequently hard of breath, reached for her hand under the table and gave it a good squeeze. It felt like an embrace, and Maggie took a deep breath, smiling again. When she glanced to her left, it was to see that Colton was watching her, that unreadable expression on his handsome face. All in all, the supper was a great success, and the Smiths stayed longer than they might have, otherwise. The weather of early summer lent itself to long twilights and nights that were cool rather than frigid or hot. As the stars began to emerge, Mike Smith made their excuses at last and went off to collect his wagon, with Colton beside him. The four women made their way to the front porch, waiting for the men to return. Beulah sat beside Alma in the swinging chair, the two older women conversing in low tones, and Maggie slipped her arm through Rosie's and walked her halfway down the garden path, away from the oil lamps in the windows. The newborn stars above them glittered in the velvet of the sky. Rosie took a deep breath. There was a faint wheeze to it that Maggie did not like, but when she glanced swiftly at her friend, Rosie was smiling as though she felt no pain. "Do you suppose it'll be a night like this, when you and Colton marry?" she said. "I can't imagine that it could be any more beautiful, but happiness makes everything look beautiful, doesn't it?" Maggie smiled back, though the thought of their wedding, unspoken as the subject was, made her heart twinge a little. "I hope so," she said. "I'd like to gather together under the stars like this, the whole town of Brownsville, all eager to dance and sing and celebrate Colton's wedding, even if it is to a complete stranger from New York." Rosie chuckled lightly. "Oh, they'll celebrate it for both of you," she assured her. "Ma tells me that you're getting to be quite a familiar face in town, especially since you've been running errands for Alma. The Hays are well loved, and that means that your kindness to them is appreciated by everyone. Yes, it will be a cause for great joy when you and Colton are married." "I hope so." "I know it," said Rosie serenely. "And it won't be long from now." "I hope not," Maggie smiled at herself. I hope. That's all I seem to do, these days." "Well," said Rosie Smith, softly, "there are worse things to do with your time." The two friends watched the sky darken overhead. "Will it be soon?" Rosie asked. Maggie shook her head. "I don't know," she responded, fighting the tinge of bitterness that seemed to inevitably stain her tone. "I've been waiting on Colton, oh, it seems like forever. But I'm afraid he's been having second thoughts." "Oh, never. Not with someone like you, Maggie. He's afraid that you might not love him, that's all, not the way he's falling in love with you." She couldn't help but smile at this, though she was glad the darkness of the night hid her blushes. "Do you really think he's in love with me, Rosie?" "I know he is," the young woman said sincerely. "I can see it in his eyes, every time he looks at you." "Yes, he's holding back, Maggie, but it isn't because he's changed his mind." "Then why?" Maggie asked quietly. Rosie was silent for a moment and then gave a deep and heartfelt sigh. "I suppose it's easier to pretend that you don't feel so strongly," she said. "Love so often means that you end up being hurt, and perhaps he thinks that if he calls it something else, he won't be hurt at all. But there's no avoiding it, Maggie, it's as much a part of life as joy is. The other half, pain and joy, are wedded, too. I wish I could convince him otherwise, Maggie said. But I can scarcely believe it myself. Most of the time, when I agreed to this match, my sister told me that I would find love again, but I was certain that nothing of the sort could ever happen to me again. Gerald, my husband, was a good man, and I loved him dearly. It would be selfish, wouldn't it, for me to think that it might happen twice? Rosie hugged her suddenly, with a strength that seemed far beyond the limits of the frail little body. Convince yourself, she whispered, and you will convince him. You're in love with him, Maggie, that great gift is here before you. All you must do is open your hand and receive it. Maggie took a deep breath. She was vaguely aware of the fact that she was trembling despite the warmth of the night. All right, she said. If you believe it of me, Rosie, then I must believe it too. I trust your feelings over mine. I will speak with him soon, tomorrow. And before you know it, you and I will dance and sing and celebrate at the wedding, under the diamond skies. The wagon came trundling up at last. Colton leapt down from it and helped first Beulah and then, carefully, Rosie into the driver's box next to Michael. As Colton took Rosie's arm, the young woman turned swiftly and clasped Maggie's in turn, linking the three of them. She smiled from one to the other, and it made Maggie's heart ache to see the love that was evident on that pain-weary face. On a night like this, she whispered, I wish you both all the joy in the world, remember that. Then she allowed herself to be lifted cautiously into the wagon. Maggie stood next to Colton, her arms wrapped around herself, and watched the Smiths drive away into the night. She shivered a little. I'm glad they haven't far to go, she said. Colton didn't respond for a moment. Then he said, yes, it won't be long before Rosie goes home. At the time, she wondered whether there was more to his statement than it seemed. But there was cleaning up to do in the kitchen, and Alma to help to bed, and the pleasantness of the evening to ponder over, turning the memories over in her mind like a piece of gold in the palm of her hand. She thought of Rosie's encouragement to speak to Colton and was glad to find that her courage had not failed her, not yet. She would speak to him tomorrow, and trust Rosie's belief that happiness would soon be theirs. But the next morning brought the news that melted her courage from her, after all. Rosie Smith had died in her sleep, and the world was a little colder, a little darker, for her passing. Chapter 7. Alma watched out the open window as the wagon pulled up in front of the house and heaved a great sigh of regret. Are you certain that you'll be all right without me? It was not the first time she had asked this question, of course. By now, Maggie suspected that she'd heard it at least a dozen times in the past day. But the answer was still the same now as it had been the first time, and she mustered a smile as she went to Alma's side and watched Colton, through the window, as he leapt down from the wagon and headed for the house. I'm certain, she said. The drive would do you no good, Alma, though of course Beulah would want to see you. And her, Alma said with another sigh, a hand going absently to her heart. Poor thing, to lose her only child. She caught her breath painfully, and Maggie was reminded that Alma knew precisely what it felt like to lose a child. Jimmy had not been her only son, of course, but she could not imagine that the pain was any less acute. Impulsively, she bent and brushed her lips across Alma's forehead, feeling overcome with fondness and compassion for her friend. She knows that you would be there with her, if you could, she said. I'll give her your love with my embrace, Alma. And you'll see her soon, I'll tell her so. She hurried out of the room, telling herself that she had to rush before tears could make themselves known. But the truth was that there were no tears, only a dry ache in her throat. She couldn't understand it. Her heart had been touched to the core by the news of Rosie's death and was torn a little bit more every time she remembered that Rosie would not be there to celebrate with her at her wedding, as she had so ardently desired. Why weren't the tears coming? She felt their absence like a dull pain all its own, tinged all around with a sallow guilt. She took a deep breath as she approached Colton, who waited for her in the driver's box. Wordlessly, he gave her a hand to help her up, and she took a seat beside him. It would be the first time they had gone anywhere alone together, and had it been for any other reason, she would have leapt at the chance to ask him about their engagement. As it was, though, she could hardly bear to speak to him at all. And he didn't seem much more inclined to conversation, his face closed and set as he whistled the horses into forward motion. It was only natural, at a time like this, for the neighbors and townsfolk to descend en masse on the house of the bereaved, offering comfort and help. The Smiths, as Maggie had been told, had no family close by. It would be at least a week before Beulah's sister and her family would be able to make it on the train from back east, and Michael's aged father could not risk the arduous travel from his home 50 miles away. Brownsville seemed determined to make up for the lack of flesh and blood. There were 5 other carts and wagons at the house already when Maggie and Colton arrived, though scarcely 6 hours had passed since the news of Rosie's death had become known. Was it possible that the young woman had been standing beside her, smiling with the joy of the beauty of the night, less than 24 hours before? It was mind-boggling to reflect on how quickly things could change. Colton helped her down from the wagon, and held onto her hand tightly, his eyes capturing hers. "Mike'll be out in the barn," he said. "I'll go and find him. I reckon the doctor and his wife will have helped with laying poor Rosie out, but if Beulah needs help with..." Maggie swallowed hard and tightened her fingers around his. "I'll do anything that she needs done," she promised, and was rewarded with that by now familiar look of gratitude and respect. He nodded and let go of her, turning to head toward the faraway shape of the barn, where Michael Smith was undoubtedly concealing his grief from the prying eyes of the neighbors. Beulah Smith had no such luxury. The women of the town were determined to be there to wipe away every tear, even if they had to stand on each other's toes to do so. Maggie took a deep breath, prayed swiftly for courage, and made her way into the house of mourning. Though the conversation was muted, out of respect, it still sounded far too loud inside the house for her liking. Half the women there were known to her, from her frequent visits to town. She greeted them politely, and impulsively asked whether they might not move the conversations out into the sunshine. If she had thought about it a little more, she knew, she likely would have shied away from the question. After all, it would be all too easy for the local women of Brownsville to take umbrage at this near stranger from New York telling them what to do. But her careful choice of words and her calm, patient tone went a long ways to keeping the peace. Gradually, the house quieted down. She hesitated in the hallway, fingers twined around each other, wondering what she ought to do next. There was no noise from the room at the end of the hall, but the door was ajar, and she could see shadows moving to and fro, cast by the sunlight through the window. That must be the room where Rosie was laid out, she knew. That must be where Beulah and the doctor's wife were, watching over her, preparing for Rosie's burial. The final rest, eternal and lasting. She turned away hastily from the door and plunged without thinking into the kitchen. There were dishes in the wash basin and the remains of a meal on the table. She puzzled over it for a moment before she realized, with a surge of compassion in her heart, that the family had been about to sit down to breakfast when Beulah and Michael realized that Rosie had not come downstairs that morning. She threw herself into the work at hand with a will, and within an hour the kitchen was spotless and shining, a pot of stew bubbling on the stove. It wasn't until then that she felt the weight of someone's gaze. She glanced hastily toward the doorway, her heart leaping. But it wasn't Colton, after all. It was Beulah, her arm held by an older, no-nonsense woman whom Maggie surmised was Dr. McKinnon's wife. Beulah's eyes filled with tears, and she opened her arms. Maggie stepped into them swiftly, gathering the older woman into her embrace and holding her tightly. "Rosie loved you so," she heard Beulah managing to gasp, between sobs. "She said she felt that you and she were kindred souls, the sister she never had." Maggie bent her head over Beulah's sagging shoulder and held on for dear life. Even then, tense and waiting for her own tears, they would not come. The rest of the day passed with interminable slowness, and Maggie knew that if it felt slow to her, it must be unbearable to Rosie's parents, who were reminded every hour that their daughter was lost to them forever. Gradually, as the afternoon waned on to evening, the townspeople packed up and went home, assured by the doctor's wife that the funeral would be held soon enough and that food and well wishes were welcome, after the family had a chance to breathe and grieve. The sun was setting when Maggie left Beulah's side. The older woman had fallen asleep in the sitting room, worn out from grief, and Maggie spread a blanket over her as she left. Dr. and Mrs. McKinnon were waiting in the kitchen, along with Colton. The doctor's wife gave Maggie a nod of acknowledgement. "She's grateful for everything you've done, my dear, and I reckon I am, too. I've known Beulah since we were children, but you put her in mind of sweet Rosie, as though she were back with her today, and I reckon that's the most good that anyone could do." She glanced around at the spotless kitchen and gave a nod of approval. "I'll come back tomorrow. But I suppose that they ought to sleep through the night and might well need a little time to simply be quiet together." Maggie nodded. "I'd be glad to come back tomorrow, if that's what you think should be done," she said. "Anything I can do to help." "You've done a great deal already, Miss Parker." It was on the tip of her tongue to correct her, Mrs., but she kept her mouth shut and gave a swift glance to Colton, who was watching her expectantly. "I understand all too well what it is to feel this kind of grief, a strike to the heart," she said quietly. "I suppose that all of us here do. If we can be there for each other, in times like this, well, that is the whole obligation of mankind, isn't it? To support each other through the bad times and rejoice together in the good." She nodded slowly, thoughtfully. Rosie knew it. "Michael is upstairs, getting himself into bed," the doctor put in, rubbing his eyes tiredly. "I gave him a sleeping draught, and I doubt he'll be up before noon tomorrow. We'll stop in then, but they'll need you more in the days ahead, Miss Maggie. There's a different kind of grief waiting for them." Maggie nodded assent, and watched as the doctor and his wife made their way out ahead of them. Something about the way Dr. McKinnon put his arm tenderly around his wife made her suspect that they, too, had endured the loss of a child. She turned to find Colton still watching her. "Shall we go home?" she asked, turning her eyes away. He waited a long moment before he nodded assent and led the way to the door, in the wake of the McKinnons. She halfway wished that he would do as the doctor had done and put an arm around her, but a latent sense of guilt made her feel that she did not deserve such a gesture. After all, if she could not even bring herself to cry over the death of a friend, over the grief of Rosie's parents, perhaps there was no true feeling left in her. Perhaps Colton was right to have second thoughts about marrying her. Even this did not bring the tears that she rightly expected. Mired in unhappy thoughts, she hardly noticed that he was watching her closely as he handed her up into the wagon and they started home. It wasn't until they were well on their way and he cleared his throat for the third time that she realized he was trying to get her attention. She turned to him questioningly and found that he was giving her a sidelong glance, with the beginnings of a tentative smile. "Are you all right, Maggie? This must have been awful hard on you. I know you didn't know Rosie for long, but it was clear the two of you were already close." Sometimes, he paused, as though pondering the precise words he wanted to say. Sometimes it only takes a moment for the heart to reach out and hold fast. She managed a smile at this, hoping that he couldn't see how fragile it was in the dim light. "It is difficult," she said. She was such a sweet young woman, and it's so unfair that her life should be cut short so swiftly. "But, Colton, it must be much harder for you. After all, you've known her whole life. You and your family are so close to the Smiths. How easy it would be to slip up and mention his brother, at this emotionally fraught moment." But she shied away from the very thought. It was pleasant to sit beside him and have him offer her condolences and compassion. The last thing she wanted to do was ruin that by bringing up his own painful past, even as she struggled with thoughts of her own. What would Gerald have done, if he were there beside her? A memory of his smile flashed across her internal vision, and she turned away again from Colton, catching her breath. Suddenly the words were tumbling out, without her permission, and she could not seem to stop them. "Oh, Colton, I'm afraid, so afraid, that I've lost something dear to me, my own kindness, my own compassion. I did love Rosie, though I scarcely knew her, and I'm all too aware of the blow that this is to her family and friends, and yet, I can't seem to bring myself to cry." She shook her head, putting her hands over her face. I feel almost numb, as though I've been out in the cold for too long. But how heartless of me. Even to see Beulah weeping, even that did not stir me as it ought to have done. I didn't used to be like this, Colton, I swear it. And I don't know how it happened, that I lost that part of me somewhere along the way. "When was the last time you cried, Maggie?" he asked her quietly. She took a deep breath. The memory was painful, but she could not avoid it. Perhaps she even deserved the pain. "On the first anniversary of Gerald's death," she said. "I thought I had cried myself out, well before then. Goodness knows I wept enough for anyone while he was ill, and then for several months after. But on that day, it was as though it had happened all over again. As though it were happening still. She shook her head again, half in wonder at herself and the intricacies at the workings of the human heart. But not since then. Not a single tear. Colton let out a long, heartfelt sigh. He lifted his head and looked up at the darkening sky. "I'm afraid I don't have any answers for you," he said. She heard him swallow hard, wondered if this were as difficult for him as it was for her, simply to talk about it. Perhaps even more so, he was a man, after all, and as his mother had said, there was a particular heaviness to a man's grief. A woman's tears lighten the load. Perhaps that was why everything seemed so heavy to her now. Now that she could not cry. But no one who knows you, Maggie Parker, would ever accuse you of being heartless. I've seen you with Ma, on her bad days. I've seen you with Rosie, kind and patient. And with Beulah and Mike, too, doing the things that they needed done, without being asked. I reckon you've got one of the biggest hearts of anyone I've ever known, whether you cry or not. She turned to him in the darkness of early nightfall and saw the reassurance in his eyes. He meant every word. She slipped a few inches along the bench, without any intention other than to be closer to him. But he responded in a way that took her by surprise, lifting his arm and draping it around her shoulders, bringing her closer still. He held on to her, a bit cautiously, but with warmth underneath it all, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes with a sigh. Unspoken, the peace between them grew. The horses moved on toward home. Chapter 8. The funeral for Rosie Smith was well attended. In her brief years, the young woman had touched the lives of nearly everyone in Brownsville and many throughout the county. The little chapel in town was packed to the rafters, with dozens more spilled out onto the greensward in front of it, all there to pay their respects. Even as the preacher commended Rosie's soul to her eternal rest, Maggie still could not manage to cry. Her heart was full to breaking point, and yet there was no relief for her. She turned her head once, to glance swiftly at Colton, and found that he was looking at her. Their eyes met, and she felt a blush rush over her cheeks, turning her scarlet. She couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking, with his eyes on her. After the long ride home, with his arm around her, things had settled into a new comfortability. He still seemed a bit aloof, but the respect that she had seen in his eyes a few times was there more often. He took note of everything she did to help Alma and keep the household running smoothly and thanked her for it without fail each day. Perhaps soon, she told herself, she would rediscover the courage that had almost led her to ask him about their wedding. But not until after Rosie was laid to rest. The next morning, after the funeral was over, she was kneading dough in the kitchen when she heard him call her name. Alma, seated at the table with her foot on a cushion, glanced up from her mending. "What?" "Go on," Alma told her, nodding as she dropped her mending and reached out for the bowl of dough. "Hand it over and I'll finish it." Maggie did as she was bid. How was it that simply hearing Colton call her name, in this unexpected fashion, could cause her to get into such a tizzy? Her heart was speeding up, her breath coming short, and she was almost painfully conscious of the trembling of her hands. It wasn't as though he were going to call her out so he could propose to her. After all, they were already engaged. "Now, Margaret Allen Parker, you just calm yourself right down and behave rationally, do you hear me? There's no call to get dizzy in the head and weak in the knees just because he's asking for you." He was waiting for her behind the house, in the yard near where his brother's tree was planted. At first, she couldn't quite fathom what he might be doing, standing there with a shovel in his hand and a half-dug hole at his feet. But then she saw the sprightly little sapling that waited, leaning against the larger trunk of the adolescent apple tree, and she knew. He didn't need to say it, but he did, explaining himself a bit haphazardly, as though embarrassed to let on what his plan was. "I reckoned you might feel better if you planted a tree for Rosie," he said. "Plenty of room for it here, and it can keep this tree company." She stopped a few feet away from him and simply looked at him for a moment, hoping that he could read the meaning in her eyes, the warmth and appreciation. He met her gaze for a moment and then ducked his head, turning away with a faint blush on his cheeks, and she knew that he understood. Still, she had to say it. "Thank you," she whispered. He turned back to his work, lifting a few more shovelfuls of good dirt from the earth, making sure it was plenty wide at the bottom to accommodate the root ball of the young tree. It was a healthy-looking sapling. She wondered where he had gotten it. He must have gone out specifically looking, and on her account, too. Smiling, she stepped up beside him, and he nodded toward the tree. "Would you do the honors, Maggie?" She lifted it carefully and he put one hand on it, helping and directing her to place it in the hole. "Hold it still." Several shovelfuls of dirt saw it safely planted, and she bent to pick up the bucket nearby, soaking the roots. He stepped back, nodding approval. She found it surprisingly hard to speak. It took her a few tries to manage. "It's beautiful." "It'll do well here," Colton said. "I reckon we'll have enough apples to make a pie from these too, within a few years." Choking a little, she managed, "Rosie would love it." Colton put his arm around her, and the tears began to flow. She wept against his shoulder, half in sorrow, half in relief, and he held her tightly until she gave a final heaving sigh. His arm dropped to its side again, but he didn't step away. "I didn't cry when Jimmy died," he said abruptly. She caught her breath. It was the first time he had spoken his brother's name aloud, and she was suddenly afraid that if she responded the wrong way, he might withdraw entirely and never speak of it again. Her silence seemed to encourage him. Rubbing his hands together and staring down at the dirt on his palms, he went on. "I knew it, too. The moment it happened, I could feel it. I reckon folks would say that it's impossible. I was thousands of miles away, in California. It was early in the morning, and I woke up suddenly, and I knew that he was dead. Didn't know how, just knew that it was true. But I told myself I was a fool to believe anything like that. Jimmy was just as hale and hearty as ever, back home, and he'd get a good laugh out of it next time I visited, if I got up the courage to tell him about it. I talked myself out of it, went back to sleep, woke up an hour later and went about my business, trying to ignore the feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. By the end of the week, I'd ignored it right away, and it wasn't both Aaron and me anymore. That was when I got the telegram from Ma, telling me that Jimmy was dead. There was nothing I could do. Even if I had left as soon as I knew it, I still would have been too late for the funeral. But there was something awful in realizing that part of me knew, and the rest of me tried to go on with my life as though nothing was wrong. "You came home as soon as you could," she said softly. "That was the most you could do, for your mother, and for Jimmy, too." He shook his head and let out a long sigh. It wasn't enough. Now, she dared to take his hand, offering him comfort as he had given her the same. "It never is," she said. "When Gerald first became ill, I thought it was nothing more than tiredness, or perhaps influenza. It wasn't until much later, when we went to the specialist, that we learned how much damage had been done to his heart. If we had acted before that, if we had spent all our money on doctors and the procedure a month before, perhaps things might have turned out differently, but even the experts could not say for sure. Best not to think about it, they said. And that was all. Not thinking about it, that was the most I could do, and Gerald, too. And then he was gone, and I was left to try not to think about it all on my own. And that wasn't enough, either." They stood together, hand in hand, and looked at the tree. "I should have never gone to California," Colton said roughly. "I should have stayed here at the ranch and helped. I was the eldest. It was my responsibility." "Surely Jimmy didn't hold it against you," she told him. "He was your brother, he must have understood." But Colton shook his head, his face expressing his doubt just as clearly as any words would have done, and she sighed again, holding him a little tighter. No matter what she said, she knew, it wouldn't be enough to change his mind. It would never be enough. A faint breeze came up, warm and redolent of summer. It sent the spindly boughs of the younger apple tree swaying toward the older, as though reaching for a comforting embrace, for the support it needed to face the future that lay just ahead. Chapter 9. "Alma, are you certain you can do without me for a bit? I won't be far away, you can holler if you need anything." Alma laughed. "Holler, eh? Goodness, Maggie, you've only been here 6 weeks, and you already sound like one of the locals." She flapped her hands at Maggie, who couldn't help but smile. Alma had been a surprisingly compliant patient, under the watchful eye of Maggie and her son, and with the stern admonition of Dr. McKinnon. Her hip was healing up well, and the twisted ankle was nearly back to normal. "Go on with you. I'll be fine. Goodness knows, I've got plenty of mending to keep me busy. Russell and Taze have started handing their socks over to me to be darned, on top of Colton's." She chuckled. "And darn them I will." The older woman did look to be comfortably set up for the next little while, with her foot elevated on a stack of cushions and a cup of tea next to her. It was a beautiful day. Maggie had opened the kitchen window and left the kitchen door propped ajar as well. She would just take another hour or two and return to the attic, she promised herself. It was too fine a day to spend much time inside, but if she left the job too much longer, it would soon be too hot to even consider the stifling interior. Best that she get on with it as quickly as she could. It would be nice to have the task done, once and for all. She'd managed to snatch a few hours here and there over the past few weeks. Just about all the furniture was cleared out, some of it had been repaired, some of it had been given away to the neighbors, and the rest had been ruthlessly chopped up to be used as firewood in the coming winter. She couldn't help but think that it might seem a little strange to poke an ornately carved chair leg into the stove, but likely she would get over it soon enough. There wasn't a great deal left to be sorted. A small trunk in the corner, a moth-eaten suitcase, a small mirror leaning up against the far wall. She dusted them off, one by one, and began to go through the trunk first. The first thing she saw, upon raising the lid, was Jimmy's name picked out in hobnails just inside. James Albert Hayes. She caught her breath. Did Alma know that her younger son's possessions were still here in the attic? Surely, she would have brought them out if she did, but perhaps not, she thought, pondering the question from another angle. After all, his death had happened so suddenly, and Colton's refusal to discuss it had been so absolute. Perhaps Alma had thought it would be easier on them both if Jimmy's things were simply left alone. Conscious of a growing feeling of both compassion and interest, she began to comb through the trunk. She would have to bring it all down for Alma to look at. Though she had been authorized to dispose of things she felt necessary, she had taken care to ensure that she kept anything that had belonged to Alma's husband, or to the boys when they were younger. This, too, was worthy of Alma's consideration. But she didn't think anyone would mind if she had a look for herself, first. A worn overcoat, far too small for a grown man, it must have been Jimmy's when he was young. A small rocking horse, rudely carved and even more rudely painted, that she was willing to bet Jimmy had made for himself. A few other items that had clearly belonged to the younger Hayes when he was just a child, and then, in the middle of a small stack of books, an envelope showed itself. Too curious to pass it up, she withdrew it and opened it up. She didn't recognize the handwriting, though it bore a superficial resemblance to the awkward, rounded writing that she knew to be Colton's. "Dear Colt. Well, I reckon you'll think I'm awful silly, writing a letter like this, man to man. But you're my brother, even if we are both men, and I figured I ought to tell you exactly what I think of you leaving us all behind. Now, don't worry. I can just see you, that look on your face that you get when you think there's about to be trouble, your eyes all squinty and your nose wrinkled. Like there's been a skunk under the house. It ain't as bad as all that. I've always known, and you know I know, that you were made for adventures. Meanwhile, your younger brother was made for staying home and taking care of things here. It's the way we are, the way we were made, and I don't imagine that either of us would be too happy if our situations were reversed. The fact is, I hope you find your fortune out there in California, just like you always wanted to. And I hope that I find the sort of happy, calm, content little life here in Brownsville, just like I always wanted. I hope we both get what we wanted. Your fortune is out there somewhere, big brother. When you find it, maybe you'll change your mind and come home. You know Ma will miss you, and so will Pa. I'll miss you, too, but we won't speak of it. We will keep our dignity, like men. But I'll miss you anyway. I can just see us now, Colt, years from now. Maybe we'll be getting old. 40 at least. But I'll be settled down with my wife, and yes, I reckon it might well be Rosie, if she'll have me, and maybe you'll come back and settle down with yours. We can raise our children right here on the ranch. Cousins are almost as good as brothers, they say. I don't reckon it's entirely true, but we'll all do our best, anyhow. You're leaving for California bright and early tomorrow, you say. Tonight was our last supper together, the four of us sitting around the kitchen table. Pa told us the story of how grandfather started the ranch. Ma told us the story of how Pa proposed. These are stories that we know like the back of our hands, Colt, stories that are part of us, but I don't reckon we'll ever tire of hearing them, all the same. You'll have stories, too, when you come back from California. It's silly to say, since I'm staying right here in Brownsville, but I hope I'm in them. Your brother, Jimmy. Maggie caught her breath and wiped away the tears from her eyes. She hadn't even been aware that she was crying at all. It had happened slowly and naturally, the only possible response to the simple, heartfelt words of the lost Hayes boy, directed to his older brother. It was undated, but if he had written it the night before Colton headed west, it must be more than a decade old. It was like a small window into the past, through which she could peer and catch sight of the way things had been for the Hayes family, back then, back when the brothers were young and hopeful, when Alma and her husband were full of life and stories to tell. She ran her fingertips over the letter, tenderly, and then wiped her eyes once more as she clambered to her feet. She couldn't wait a moment more to show the letter to Colton. This time of day, nearing luncheon, she knew that he would be out in the meadow behind the barn. For the past few days, he'd been working on irrigation ditches, hoping that he might take advantage of any rainstorms like the one they'd had weeks before, channeling any prospective water into a new pond for the cattle. Sure enough, there he was, knee-deep in the trench, hatless, his thick dark hair running wild. Not for the first time, she felt a little thrill run through her at how handsome he was, even covered in mud. Colton. He looked up and climbed out of the trench without waiting to be asked. Everything all right? Alma is fine, don't worry, she reassured him, reaching out to lay a hand on his sleeve. He nodded, wiping at his forehead with the back of his hand. That was his chief concern, she knew, but even with that reassurance, there was still worry in his dark eyes. And you, he said. Her heart squeezed a little to hear the note of care in his voice, but she only smiled, managing to keep her voice light. Just fine, thank you, Colton. I was in the attic again, and I found something that I thought you needed to see right away. She held out the letter to him. He froze, staring at it, and she knew that he must recognize the handwriting. She tried to imagine how he must feel, confronted with a message from the past, but as painful as it might be, it would be worth it, she was certain. It answered everything he had wondered about, his brother's feelings about him, and the guilt that Colton felt over leaving the ranch behind to head west. It answered it all, and more. But Colton did not speak, nor did he make any motion to open the letter and read it for himself. She pressed on, feeling as though she ought to urge him to do so, and suddenly, halfway worrying that he might not read it at all. He wrote it just before you left for California, she said. I read it. I hope you don't mind. I was so curious, I don't know what happened, what caused him not to give it to you. Perhaps he forgot about it until after you had left. But even so, Colton. He took the letter at last, turned from her, and put it in his pocket. Colton. Wordlessly, he jumped back into the ditch and reached for his shovel. She stood there for a few moments, watching him lift load after load out of the earth, until at last she gave a long sigh and turned to go back to the house. It was a long and rather quiet evening, despite the beauty of it. Colton was not entirely silent, but there was no denying that he was absent and preoccupied. Even Alma took note and cast a worried glance at Maggie. Maggie kept her thoughts to herself. She had not mentioned the letter to Alma. It was Colton's letter, after all, and his was the right to discuss it or not. And to read it or not. She could only hope that he had. That night, she lay awake for a long time, praying with her eyes wide open, fixed on the full moon. He did not come in for breakfast the next morning. Alma seemed to put herself out to be even more cheerful than usual. She declared her ankle entirely healed and got herself around the kitchen without the help of a borrowed arm, though she did condescend to use the cane that the doctor had suggested. Watching her revel in her newfound movement, Maggie could not help but smile, despite the lingering pain and confusion in her heart. After the breakfast dishes were done, she felt rather at loose ends. For the last few weeks, especially while Alma needed her help, she had started to feel as though the house were her own, as though it truly were her home, as though she were already the mistress of the household. But now, in the wake of Colton's strange silence, she felt doubts begin to reassert themselves. She had thought that they were past all that, moving on to the next step which would lead them to their wedding. Was she wrong, after all? Had it been too much to hope? Alma seemed to sense her unhappiness. She stepped up to her and put an arm around her shoulders, smiling at her tenderly. "It'll all be right in time, my dear," she whispered. "Don't give up on him yet." Maggie returned the embrace, smiling. "Never," she promised. "Do you mind if I go for a little walk, Alma? I feel that I need a little time to think about things." "Of course, my dear. After all, I'm fit as a fiddle." She did a little shuffle, with a beam on her face as though she were dancing a jig. Maggie chuckled to herself as she made her way to the kitchen door and stepped out into the sunshine. Once outside and on her own, she found herself strangely reluctant to venture too far from the house. It was true that Alma didn't need her close by, and how glad she was that her friend was healing so well. It had been a frightening prospect, to think that the vital, strong woman might lose her ability to walk entirely. But even though Alma did not need her help now, Maggie still was not inclined to go too far away. She meandered toward the young apple trees and stopped to admire them. Reaching out to the younger of the two, she touched her fingertips to the few leaves that were sprouting. There were more on the way, she was glad to see, and even a bud, which seemed far too early in the sapling's life. But she could imagine Rosie's delight at seeing that single swelling, with pink already tinging the edges, ready to blossom into life. "I do wish you were here, Rosie," she said softly. "I wish I could ask you what you think about all of this, but I suppose I know what you would say, anyhow. You'd tell me to keep the faith, to be patient and wait. Love hopes all things." She turned to Jimmy's tree, stepping close enough to stroke the slim trunk. There was strength in there, despite appearances. Both young trees were built to withstand any storm wind, to bend without breaking, to blossom forth, to give their best, and all in due season. At the right time. She was speaking aloud almost without realizing it, her thoughts pouring from her. "When I first agreed to come here," she said, "I had no idea of falling in love again. Goldie. That's my sister, she told me that she believed it would happen. That Gerald would have wanted me to marry again, to love again, but all I wanted was a fresh start. A new beginning. I thought that would be enough." She was quiet for a moment. "That was foolish of me, wasn't it? A heart that has loved never wants to stop loving. I've been too richly blessed to be entirely content with only the essentials. And now that I know Colton, now that my heart knows him, I understand that anything less than love will never be enough." She stroked the tree's branches, tenderly. "That's how we feel, isn't it? When we lose someone we love. That nothing we ever do will be enough. Have I lost Colton, now?" She sighed. "I wish I knew how he felt, Jimmy. I wish I knew if there was any chance that he would ever love me the way I love him." The tree rustled and sighed, and she spun around on her heels, eyes wide. Colton stood a few feet away. He smiled. "I guess you'd like to tell me that I oughtn't to eavesdrop on private conversations, even if they are between a girl and a tree," he said. I think you ought to know better, certainly," Maggie gulped, her cheeks aflame. "Well, you ought to know better than to read letters that aren't addressed to you," he returned mildly. "So, I reckon we're just about even." He stepped forward, and she nearly backed up into the tree, so intense was his gaze. That unreadable expression was there, too, but alongside it, the look she now recognized as respect. "If you'd like to know how I feel about you," he said, "I reckon I might be able to answer a little more clearly than the apple tree." "Yes, but it takes a great deal more courage to speak with you than it does with saplings," she managed. "Why, I've been trying to get my courage up for weeks." A mere foot from her now, he stopped and bowed his head. "I know," he said softly. "I haven't made it easy for you. I have no excuse for my behavior, Maggie, I've been a little confused myself, I guess. Feelin' guilty, as though I don't deserve someone like you. As though I ought to ask for nothing more from life than what I've already got. How could a man like me ever deserve the love of a woman like you, Maggie Parker? Unable to speak, she reached out a hand to him. He caught it in his and raised it to his lips, pressing a swift, warm kiss to her fingers. Then he turned it over, palm up, and reached into his pocket. I read Jimmy's letter, he said roughly. It took just about everything I had, but I did. And then I wept for him, the way I never could weep after he died. He didn't give me the letter, Maggie, because I was too chicken. I left the house early that morning, before he or Ma and Pa were even awake. I left early, because I was too afraid to say goodbye. He bit his lip and pulled something from his pocket. He told me that he hoped I would find my fortune. Well, I reckon I did. Into her open palm, he laid something small and heavy. She tore her eyes away from his face to see the golden nugget glinting in her hand. But it wasn't out there in California, Colton breathed. It was right here at home. It's you, Maggie Parker. Worth your weight in gold, and I love you with all my heart. She closed her fist around the gold, stepped up close to him, and put her arms around his neck. For a moment they gazed into each other's eyes, and then at last, he nodded. Marry me? She pressed her mouth to his, all the answer she needed to give, and he held her tightly, arms around her waist. The sunlight shone down on them, dappled by the leaves of the twin apple trees. The branches danced in the summer breeze, they bent, but did not break. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susanna Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susanna Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susanna Calloway Western romance.